Hello, my name is Larry Lee. I'm a longtime resident of the Yukon and past president and life member of the Yukon Fish and Game Association. We're here today to talk about chronic wasting disease, or CWD as it's commonly referred to. CWD is a contagious neurological disease affecting deer, elk, and moose, cervids. It creates many small holes in the brain of the animal and eventually leads to the death of the animal. Common signs of the presence of CWD include a rough coat, a loss of body condition, excessive drooling, and an imbalanced gait while walking. While similar in nature to mad cow disease in cattle, there is no evidence to indicate that CWD can be transferred to humans. Where present in the wild deer herd, CWD has spread relentlessly. We must take steps to prevent the arrival of chronic wasting disease in the Yukon and the infection of our wildlife. For information on the spread of chronic wasting disease, we turn to Mary Vanderkopf, the Chief Veterinary Officer of the Government of Yukon Department of Environment.
Chronic wasting disease was first identified in Colorado in captive deer, and it has since spread throughout Canada, particularly in Saskatchewan and Alberta, in areas where there is game farming activity. And it's believed that it was introduced through animals brought in, elk and deer brought in for the game farming industry. It has occurred in the wild, in wild deer populations in Alberta and Saskatchewan, and where it has been present in the wild, it has spread relentlessly. So various attempts to control the disease by reducing the population of deer have been ineffective in eliminating it. It is spread through a variety of body secretions, including urine and feces and saliva, and so the agent contaminates the feeding and watering areas where deer congregate. The prion actually becomes more effective when it binds to clay soils, and so it makes the potential for that prion to be introduced into Yukon even more significant, since it could represent a permanent environmental contaminant here. We are involved in doing surveillance for chronic wasting disease by examining the brains of animals that are either roadkill or hunter kill. So deer and elk in particular. In the laboratory in the animal health unit, we examine the brains and the lymph nodes of these animals to attempt to detect chronic wasting disease, and so far we haven't found it here.
A number of new regulations have been passed in the Yukon to prevent the arrival of chronic wasting disease. Included in these regulations is a ban on importing of live cervids into the Yukon for game farming purposes. Also, hunters are prohibited from bringing deer or deer parts from elsewhere in Canada into the Yukon, with some exceptions. The exceptions are as follows. Cervids killed in the Northwest Territories and northern British Columbia are allowed because there is no history of chronic wasting disease in those areas, and there is a natural overlap of those herds. From the rest of Canada, you can import the meat from your hunt into the Yukon, but you cannot bring in any parts of the brain or the spinal column. All parts of the brain and the spinal column must be separated and left behind before arrival in the Yukon. You can still have your animal taxidermy mounted or tanned in the Yukon, but raw parts must be kept in a tightly sealed container to prevent leakage. Have the hide delivered to be tanned within 5 days of your arrival in the Yukon. Make sure all parts are labeled as to species, including your name and the area in which it was obtained. You can import teeth from cervids into the Yukon, provided they have been completely removed from the skull of the animal. Antlers attached to the skull cap can also be imported to the Yukon, provided there is no hide or tissue on any part of the skull cap. Whole skulls must not be brought back into the Yukon because of the possibility of the presence of tissue or hide on the inside of the skull. Hunting lures that contain cervid body tissues or fluids are banned in the Yukon. These tissues may come from an area where chronic wasting disease has been identified. One of the main concerns is that chronic wasting disease may affect the northern caribou herds in their long-distance travels. This may spread chronic wasting disease throughout the north. You can help Yukon wildlife by following these new regulations. It's most important that you only bring back to the Yukon those parts of deer, elk, or moose that were harvested outside of the Yukon in the exempt areas. While it is mandatory that Yukon hunters submit the heads of elk harvested, it is suggested that all hunters submit the head of any cervid harvested in the Yukon for CWD testing. This adds to the surveillance information that's required for disease testing in the Yukon. Let's keep the Yukon healthy. For more information on this topic, you can contact Yukon's Department of Environment or refer to the hunting regulations summary produced annually, or contact the Yukon Fish and Game Association for information on this problem. They are aware of what's happening.